I'm Herman Faust, and this is Enjoy It While It Lasts. When you've grown up living your life in and out of the hospital for as long as you can remember, even as a small child, you have no memories of a time where it was not a part of your life. It just feels normal. It becomes almost a home away from home, where you find your own routines and your own comforts, and you gain a better understanding of the staff and the schedule and your own needs, including entertainment. Today's episode is going to be about what it's been like for me in the day-to-day, in the experience of actually being in the hospital. I'm going to talk about the food, the people, the pokes, and maybe give you some insight on what it's like to be in the hospital a lot if it's something that you have only experienced a couple times or not at all. If you like what you hear, be sure to hit follow or subscribe on whatever platform you are listening to this podcast on right now. Enjoy. For the first 28 to 29 years of my life, I had to be hospitalized about every 6 months, with a couple of exceptions where it maybe got stretched out a little bit longer in between infections, and also a couple of times where I had complications to where I needed to be hospitalized 3 or 4 times in a year. Between the ages of 29 and 33 is when I was hospitalized the most in my life. I was needing to be admitted much more frequently, and those stays lasted quite a bit longer. My lungs had deteriorated quite a bit during that time, and I got to the point of being very near death, or at the very least near needing a lung transplant. Now, I ended up not getting the lung transplant, and obviously I'm here talking, so I have not died yet. This was after some new medications were able to be discovered that helped me recover past the point that most doctors thought I would recover. I ended up getting to a point now where not only am I still alive, but I am more stable than I have ever been, including the fact that I have not been in the hospital for the last 2 years. Now, I haven't decided yet. I may or may not do an episode that is specifically focused on the time where I was at my worst. Now, for today's episode, the reason I mentioned what I just did about how often I've been in the hospital in my life is to let you know that I am speaking from a place of a little bit of authority in my experience. I'm a regular customer, so to speak. Normally, it's a 7-day hospital visit with another 7 days on IV antibiotics at home. Whenever I was a kid, it used to be a full 2 to 3 weeks in the hospital at a time, before eventually they started letting me do IV antibiotics at home. As a kid, when I had to do IV antibiotics at home, for a while, they had to have nurses come out pretty regularly, including to replace the IVs. Eventually, they started putting midlines, which are IV lines that just go up further. They're deeper into your vein. And eventually, a little bit later after that, they started putting in PICC lines, which theoretically could stay there for 6 months if they needed to. As far as how I'm doing during this time, usually I'm coughing up a bunch of mucus. That's why I am being admitted in the first place. And I'm having a little bit more trouble breathing than I would normally have. And typically by day 5, I have started to feel better. Usually maybe even day 3. I've started to be able to breathe a little bit easier, to cough up a little bit less. And by the time I am getting out of the hospital, usually I am feeling almost back fully to my baseline. Now, during the worst of my health, whenever I was very near either death or transplant, I was in the hospital more frequently. They lasted longer, and I did not end up feeling the progression until maybe a week to 10 days, if at all, of antibiotics. But for the purposes of this episode, where I'm just telling you the inside story of like what it is like living your life for a large chunk of it in the hospital, I'm not going to be using that time period as a frame of reference too much. I'm just trying to give you a little context of what my actual health and what I'm feeling physically is like while I'm in there. But mainly, this episode is about the experience of hospital life itself. Whenever I have a lung infection and it's time for me to go into the hospital, it starts with packing. I always go into the hospital carrying a bunch of bags as if I am on a vacation going into a hotel. It used to be that I would be able to be directly admitted, that my doctors would be able to just order me a bed, and as soon as it was ready, they would call me and I would go into carry my stuff into admission, and from there to the room. Nowadays, the hospital policies have changed to where I have to go in through the ER. Unless I happen to be coming directly from my doctor's appointment. But most of the time when I have an infection, I call my doctors and let them know, and then they get the process started. It's rare that the timing just happens to work out, that right whenever I have realized that the infection has gotten bad enough that I need to be hospitalized, that it's the same day or the next day before my doctor's appointment. So usually I'm carrying all these bags into an ER, and because I am sick and to the point of needing hospitalization, that means the hospital trip usually starts with me walking from the car to the ER room, carrying a bunch of stuff, and having to pause several times so I can catch my breath. Because obviously I'm in a time where I am struggling breathing, or else I wouldn't be there. I'm also normally the only one in the ER that has a bunch of bags with me. Now, my doctors, part of starting the process is they're putting in the orders for me. So the ER doctors already know like which antibiotics I need to get started on. So eventually, once I get back to the ER room, I will get an IV placed in and I will get the first dose of my medication. And that typically is what I consider the starting point. Whenever I get that first dose of antibiotics actually started, that's the first thing that's going to make me actually recover. It also marks either the first or the second needle poke, depending on if they got my blood before or after. I always like to keep count during admissions to see how many pokes this one's going to get me. Usually I'll be in the ER for a couple of hours until they have a bed open up, and then I am transported along with all of my bags to the hospital room, my hotel room / hospital room that I'm going to be staying at for the next 7 days or so. One thing I've learned is that it really matters what part of the hospital you're in, what wall you're facing, because that determines what view you have. There is definitely a big difference in quality of what your view is based on what direction you're facing. You could be facing downtown and have a really cool view at night and also have a lot more motion in your view. You could be facing the front of the hospital, which a lot of times at least has a fountain or a garden area to look at, or you could be facing a area that just has a more natural view to it, or you could be facing a building that is basically just a warehouse with a bunch of small streets surrounding it. So that's the first thing you really notice when you walk into your room. But that affects what you are able to see out your window, not what you got to do. So my first order of business is to unpack my bags and get myself situated. The reason I have bags and not just a single small bag to take it with me is because I like to wear my own clothes when I'm in the hospital. I don't wear the hospital gowns at all unless it's one of those times where it is mandatory for a particular procedure, and in which case I will immediately switch back into my own clothes as soon as I can. So I unpack all my clothes, get them situated in the drawers. I take out my chargers for my phone, my laptop, get them plugged in near my bedside. And I also always bring at least a couple of books with me. I designate a bag as my dirty clothes bag that I will be putting my clothes into as I take them off and change, and usually set that up in some corner, or if they have a closet like space in most rooms, they have something like that where I put it in. And I also lay out my hats. I always, along with my own clothes, I always wear hats. At least I used to for well over a decade. Recently, with me growing my hair out longer than I did when I was younger, I still wear hats, but not nearly as often. But for most of my adult life, I wore hats most days. So in the hospital, I would bring at least seven so I could have one per day and not have to be repeating. And besides being able to switch out wearing them, I would lay them out as almost a decorative reminder of my home. At some point, either during or immediately after my setup, a nurse would come in and we would get started on all of the intake questions. There's about 10 to 15 minutes worth of questions that go over your health, go over your ability to take care of yourself once you get discharged, and the items you brought with you so that they can catalog them in case anything goes missing, as well as a safety check, both on your mental state and your safety at home. And this is where it's been funny a couple of times whenever my wife has been with me at the moment of admission, at the day of admission, and she's been in there whenever the questions are being asked. Because they always ask the question, do you feel safe with the people in your home? And every time if we're there, I immediately can't help it but to lock eyes with her and make a face. Don't ask me that when she's here. I'll either answer, no, I'm not safe, or I'll change my voice, my tone, and I'll just give a timid, everything's fine. I'm safe at home. There was one time where, as soon as knowing that the question was coming, as soon as they asked it, Brenda interrupted and really quickly was like, yes, he's safe. And while I am obviously joking in that moment, I do think they should be more aware of only asking those types of questions when the patient is actually by themselves for what seems to me to be pretty obvious reasons. At this point in my childhood is when they would give me the paper menu that had the options of food for the next day, where I would circle whichever one of the few options that they listed that I thought sounded best, but also because I have cystic fibrosis, and part of that is having a high calorie, high sodium diet, I was allowed to write in certain choices that were off menu, or even circle both of the meal options for a given meal if I wanted to. And since I had not filled out that type of menu the previous day, the first day of admission was always a roll of the dice, because since you didn't pick, they are going to bring you whichever of the items they feel is best, I guess. I don't really know how they decide. I always guessed that whichever meal they sent to people who were there on the first day, that's the one that did not get picked by the most people the day before. Now, the advantage I had as a CF patient was that there were snack fridges that were specific to CF diets. These were accessible on demand by asking your nurse to give you access, and they were filled beyond the normal juice and jello that the regular snack fridges for most patients had. They had more high calorie things like Hot Pockets or different ice creams beyond the sherbet that was in the regular fridge. And they also had sodas instead of juice. And also, if you were a CF patient, you would get, in addition to the meals, predetermined snacks that they would send you. And a lot of times this would include Ensure Plus, so you could have the higher calories, but also sometimes milkshakes or cookies. So for a lot of my time growing up, nutrition was not overly emphasized to me beyond the fact of you need to eat lots of calories. It wasn't until I got older that they really started to preach that you need to make sure that you're eating the right kind of calories. I don't know if this was a change in research and they realized that they are pushing a lot of CF patients towards getting diabetes, or if this was more just a matter of, as the younger kids, you need to make sure that they are eating as much as they can, whatever they get, and you didn't really have to worry about it as much until you got older. But either way, as a kid, all the way up till I was in my teenage years, it was pretty much just giving as much sweets and desserts as you could possibly eat to make sure that you're getting enough calories. The way I got food definitely changed throughout the years, and partially because I was not always at the same hospital. I was at Children's Hospital for a large part of my time as a kid, of course. At some point in my early teen years, we ended up switching to a different hospital. It was the same doctors, but they had me admitted to a different hospital. I'm not sure if this was insurance purposes at the time or if there was a medical reason, but I still had the same doctors following me. And at this one, it was completely different. Instead of them giving me a menu to order from ahead of time, it was they would give me vouchers. And every meal, I could go downstairs and go to the cafeteria and use the voucher they had. And because I was on that high calorie diet, my voucher was, I think, $5 more than the typical patient would receive, enough for me to get a meal and a snack each time, beyond the insure that they would be giving me as well. This development was a dramatic turn for me in hospital food. Now, I never really felt the stereotypical jokes of like, oh, hospital food is disgusting, because I was still getting sent like pizza slices that maybe not the best pizza, but it's still pizza slices or burgers. But going downstairs to the cafeteria and being able to go to the different stations that they had was a big game changer for me. One, they had a Chick-fil-A, and this was my first exposure to Chick-fil-A, by the way. But they had two main rotating stations where every day they were serving different meals. One day it might be a barbecue station, the next day it might be a rice bowl station, but they would always have a rotating station down in the cafeteria. And I would always go look at what is available there first. And if neither one of those caught my fancy, I would go hit up the grill and just get whatever sandwich or burger for the day that I wanted. This time period is also where I started eating salads, although at the time it was a little bit of lettuce and a lot of croutons, cheese, and ranch. The next time my hospital changed that I was admitted to, the way that I got food also changed. This time I was given a menu that is basically the options that were available all the time, and I was able to call down an order on demand. Basically like room service, adding to my hotel stay feel. There are two big problems with the room service style delivery for food. The first is that they cut off taking orders by 7 p.m. So if you are somebody that tends to want your dinner to be a little bit later, you better make sure that you remember to order it before you want it. The second big problem with this is that it is a fixed menu. It's the same every day, and it's the same each hospital stay. It really adds to the feeling of repetitiveness. Even if you would have ended up eating pretty much the same 4 or 5 meals by going down to the cafeteria or by giving rotating choices, it feels a lot more daunting just by looking at a menu, and you already know because I've been here 3 times in the last year and a half, and I've tried everything on the menu, and I know I don't like most of it. So I'm already going into it knowing what my few things I'm going to be eating every single day is. Most recently, it has gotten better because it's more of a hybrid system. I still get the menu and the room service style delivery. However, they have started reincorporating the meal voucher to where I get one meal voucher a day. CF patients get that. So at least once a day, and I always use this for lunch because that's when they're most active and have the most stations open. That once a day where I will go down and choose from a bigger variety of food. Plus, it gives you an excuse to leave your room, leave your floor at least once a day to walk around and explore the hospital a little bit. So now we are admitted, we're in the room, we're situated, we have an understanding of how we're going to eat. Let's try to wind down from our first day of admission. You're feeling sick and needing to recover. That's why you're there. And a big part of recovery is rest, getting good sleep. That's just something that does not really happen in the hospital. I'm not even going to spend a lot of time talking about the issues of the beds themselves and how that by itself can be uncomfortable enough to be an issue with you getting any kind of quality of sleep. That just is what it is. Another thing that just is what it is the fact that you are going to be getting IV antibiotics overnight. So that means you are going to have the tube going from the machine to your arm or wherever your IV is. So if you're somebody who naturally moves in their sleep, you're going to be getting tangled up with that. There's also the fact that you're never really in a quiet environment. There's always some kind of noise in the hallway. People walking by, just having a conversation with each other because to them, this is just their job and they're just walking through the hallways talking to their coworker. Or maybe the machine in the patient's room next door starts beeping. Not to mention if your own IV machine beeps. If you're a light sleeper, you're going to have even more trouble. And for me, I am both a light sleeper and somebody that moves in their sleep. So I have a lot of trouble. At least it's been a little bit better for me in my adult years once I've started being able to use different white noise apps on my phone to try to focus on that noise instead of whatever's going on outside. But also the room itself, it doesn't ever get all the way dark. There's some small lights that do not turn off. And I'm somebody that prefers to sleep in as much darkness as possible. But beyond all of that, the biggest factor in your sleep is whether or not you have a nurse that knows how to be stealthy. There are some nurses that know how to come into your room and set up your antibiotic without making a noise and without using any extra light. And then there's some that, for some reason, feel the need to turn on the lights every single time they come into your room. I really feel like that should be a fireable offense. If you are a night nurse and you need to work by turning on a light in a patient's room, you are guaranteed that you are interrupting their sleep in the worst possible way. And then there's some that even like to talk as they do it. They like to check in on you, even as you're trying to keep your eyes closed and hold on to whatever little bit of sleep you can and hope that you can fall back asleep easily. I have felt extremely irritated at times at this type of nurse as I try to always be very patient and friendly to every single hospital staff that I encounter, but I have a difficult time hiding my annoyance whenever they are turning on the light and then asking if I'm okay as I'm laying there trying to hold on to sleep. Like, why are you a night nurse? Go to day shift. When me and my wife started dating, we moved in together fairly quickly after dating for only about 3 months. And even before that, there was a lot of times of us spending the night at each other's place. And so, pretty much right away from the first time I was hospitalized, she ended up spending the nights with me and sleeping on the rollaway couches they had. Sometimes we would get a cot, sometimes there was a fold out bed. It just depended on the room, as different rooms had different accommodating furniture. She would get up in the morning and go to work from the hospital and come back after making a pit stop if she had to get a change of clothes, and would end up staying on the weekends as well. Now, this was definitely good for me. It helped me not feel lonely in the hospital. It helped the time be more entertaining and also just more normal because we so quickly got used to just being around each other all the time. But it was not just for me though. It was mutual. She also had gotten used to just being around each other all the time and did not want to have to be in the house by herself. And she especially didn't want to have to sleep in the home by herself, uh, and then have to be waking up at every single noise she heard and scared because she was alone. So she might have actually slept better in the hospital than she would have slept at our home if I was not there. For the few years we lived in Nacogdoches and I was still being hospitalized in Dallas whenever I had to be admitted, she would make the drive to be with me on the weekends and have her mom stay with her during the work week so that she wouldn't have to be alone. But that was the first time that the hospital felt really lonely to me at night because I had gotten so accustomed to her always being right there with me. Then, whenever our kids came along, she obviously could not be staying with me anymore. We couldn't have the kids up there with us. So, in the last 9.5 years, whenever I have been in the hospital, I have had to get used to the idea of being alone at night again. Now, when I'm in the hospital, the nightly routine consists of a couple video calls in the afternoon to see her face and the kids' faces, and especially one as they are all getting ready for bed to tell them goodnight. And they like to excitedly tell me how they're on my bed and they are sleeping. I have a very big body pillow, and how they're going to be using that pillow, um, kind of teasing me about the fact that they're all going to be using my spot on the bed because that's what they do whenever I'm in the hospital. They all sleep in the bed with mommy. So they'll tease me about using my spot on the bed and taking my pillow. And then they always like to tease their mom as well because they always tell me what they ate for the day. And we keep a running track of all the different things they ate and what they probably would have eaten if I was at home, since I'm the one that normally prepares all the meals. And Brenda is a self proclaimed non cook. It's not like I will never have a dinner out of a microwave or out of a can, but they definitely see the difference between it happening every day versus it happening a couple times a week, maybe. Besides the video calls, we always make sure that they have at least one day in my week that I'm admitted that she will bring them up and have a visit. They always come up with their bags full of toys and coloring books and things like that to where they can keep themselves playing and we have a chance to visit and talk. They always like to look out of the window and um, even whether the view is good or not, they like to kind of lean up against the window, especially my youngest daughter. She's kind of a thrill seeker. I think she is not at all worried about the idea of what if that window broke. She likes to make her mother scared by leaning on the window. And they also are very curious. They love to ask a million questions about all the stuff in the room and of every hospital staff that comes into the room. They'll ask them basically, what exactly are you doing? Why? How does that help? What do you do with other patients? And they basically just want to know everything that's going on everywhere. And of course, predictably, they like to play on the bed, making it go up and down. Now, that's always great for me, and it boosts my morale whenever they come up. But it also means that me and Brenda never really get any time to visit just the two of us nowadays whenever I'm in the hospital because the kids are going to be there every time. Whenever it was the COVID era of heavy restrictions, they weren't allowed to come up and visit at all. So the times that I was in the hospital during that year and a half time period was a lot rougher. I ended up going downstairs and meeting them outside a few times, but because we were just meeting out next to the entrance of the hospital, it was always a lot shorter of a visit. Maybe one time where they didn't even get out of the van, they just kind of passed by and I went to them just to talk for a couple of minutes. But it was a lot rougher because we didn't get to have an actual full visit. As for what my routine of every day looks like in the hospital, the day always starts with me waking up for my first breathing treatment of the day. That's always the most important breathing treatment of the day for me because your mucus in your lungs is at its thickest after an overnight sleep. And that means it's the hardest time for me to breathe before I get that treatment, or sets of treatments, I should say. And this gives me a chance to talk about the respiratory therapist. I want to say that out of all hospital staff, most of the closest relationships I've had that actually feel like friendships are with a few of the respiratory therapists. Part of this is because a single set of treatments can take anywhere from 10 to 25 minutes, depending on how many I have that round. So they're in the room for stretches of time, and the one that has day shift, I see them 3 times for 3 sets of treatments. So I have a few of them that I have had really great conversations with, and it's almost like we are just picking up on a conversation that we had from 6 months ago, updating each other about what's going on with our lives, but also just talking about whatever thing it is that we talk about. Some I talk about sports, some I talk about the kids more. Just it depends on the person I'm talking to. Now, on the other end of the social interaction spectrum, there are several respiratory therapists that basically just stare at you very awkwardly for the entire time you're taking your breathing treatment. I don't know if they feel the need to make sure that you are not letting the medication go to waste, that you're actually breathing it in. I don't know if they are watching to make sure that I am looking healthy the whole time and not looking like I'm about to pass out. I just know that whenever I have one of these respiratory therapists, I try my best to just look at my phone and not notice that I am being observed the whole time. The middle ground, of course, is somebody who, there's some that maybe know how to have at least a little bit of pleasantry, or maybe you don't talk that much, but they are looking at their own charts or whatever they're doing on their computer and looking at the outside the window or something. And that sometimes can be its own type of awkward, just like it can be its own type of awkward if there's somebody who maybe does talk a little bit, but y'all just don't quite click. But both of those are way better than the ones that just stare at you the whole time, making you feel more like an exhibit than a person. Also, I want to say that you might be surprised at the amount of hospital staff that don't know how to do their jobs very well. And it's not even a big chunk, but there are enough for it to be notable. In respiratory therapist case, I've had several times where I've had to stop the therapist from mixing my medications into the same nebulizer for me to breathe them all in at once. And I've had to explain that no, these have to be breathed in separately. I have to do them in a specific order, even that I can't just put them all in the same nebulizer and inhale them all at once. That's not how this medication works. Then, before long, the nurse will come in with all of my pills that I got to take in the morning, which is quite a few. And on top of that, I am able to see what nurse I have for the day. And while it doesn't have as great of an impact as what nurse I have at night does on my sleep, the nurse you have during the day does have an impact on how smooth you feel like your day is going to go. Very similar to what I said about respiratory therapists, there are a lot of nurses that feel like you have just this ongoing relationship with, that every time they come into your room, it's a positive experience, and they also know what they're doing. It's they're clearly an expert at their job when it comes to medication management and noticing what they need to notice. And there are the other nurses that are a little bit more awkward, that maybe they know what they're doing, but it has this weird tension in the room every time they're there, to where you have a sigh of relief every time they leave, and you can't always pinpoint the reason why. It's just an awkward energy. And there's also been a lot of times where I have had to explain my medication to nurses, where I've had to explain that a certain medication is only taken whenever I am eating, for example. Or I've even had to help nurses understand how to work the IV pump if they're a newer nurse. And this is something that I've dealt with for many years in the hospital and watched other people. I know how to work the machine, so I've had to kind of coach them up a little bit. Shortly after that, I will see the doctor come around for their rounds to check on my progress and keep me updated on how much longer the plan is for us to stay. For a lot of my life, the doctor that I saw in the hospital was always one of the two doctors that I would see in clinic. But then at some point, I don't know if the pulmonary team expanded, or if they changed the way they do things. But now I will either see the doctor that I see in clinic, or there's a couple of other doctors that rotate from the pulmonary team that will be seeing me while I'm in the hospital. Now, I've been in there enough to where I've gotten to know these doctors almost as well as I know the doctor I see in clinic all the time. And more importantly, they've gotten to know me. So not only do we have a pretty good rapport just whenever they're in the room, but they also know exactly what type of orders I will need in the hospital, and also once it's time to be discharged. One of the big differences that I have compared to a lot of people is whenever I do get a PICC line in, I don't get sedated. I have never needed to be sedated for that type of thing. And the reason that that matters is if you're sedated, you cannot eat in the day of your procedure before it happens. And I've had times where I've been scheduled to get a PICC line in a certain day, and I have not gotten it until like 4 p.m. And obviously that's a very long time to go if you're hungry and you're supposed to be on this high calorie diet. And normally that's not something that they will allow patients to just say ahead of time, oh, I'm not going to do that, because they might at the last minute decide that they do need to be sedated. But seeing as I've been through this so many times through the years, they all know that that's not going to be an order that's needed for me. It's always better if you can get that put in as soon as possible, because an IV in a regular vein only lasts so long, and there are different factors, including the type of antibiotics that you're on. And I'm on what would be considered pretty strong antibiotics. And that can blow the vein, make the IV not be viable anymore. And that, of course, means they got to replace the IV, increasing that poke count. And if depending on the skill of the nurse that's there at the time, the day that you need to get your IV put in, that could increase your poke count one time, or it could increase it 3 or 4 times if they have to keep trying. But also, it stops the need to have a needle poke to get a blood draw, because they can take your blood through the PICC line. The other hospital staff that you deal with on a regular basis are the techs that come in to take your vital signs and change your bedding and maybe bring you whatever you need into your room. And generally speaking, there is a lot less of a chance of getting the awkward person that's your tech. They are normally a lot more guaranteed to be personable, or at least to be in and out without any level of awkwardness. With everybody that has to come and go in your room throughout the day, part of the first full day there for me is figuring out my medication schedule that is really dependent on what time the first medication got started and how often it's going to be, which can vary depending on what medications I'm on. And then kind of timing out when the next person is going to come into the room, so I know how long I have in between each. When I figure out when my longer gaps are, when I might be able to take a nap, or if I wanted to start watching a movie that I didn't want to have to stop every 5 minutes or so, and also when my more active times are, so that I am doing something that I don't mind being interrupted as much. As I'm trying to figure out the timing of the room intrusions and when my quote unquote free time is in the day, there is one more category of hospital staff that I also have to learn and deal with on a regular basis, and that is the physical therapist. If you're in the hospital for any more than a day or two at a time, you will have a physical therapist come in to make sure that you are getting enough movement. That could be a little bit more brutal if you have a physical therapist that you don't quite click with conversationally, because you are going to be either walking the hall or on a treadmill for 30 plus minutes, and they're going to be right there next to you the whole time. And physical therapy has looked a couple of different ways for me throughout the years. There has been the times where you are basically just walking laps around the wing of the hospital for 30 minutes, like I said, and they're monitoring your oxygen level the whole time. For a while, they brought in a stationary bike and made sure that I was using it at least for the time that the physical therapist was there, but then also encouraging me to use it and throughout the day, basically. And lastly, they have had a treadmill that I have had access to at times and then not had access to at other times, depending on the hospital's policy on my specific diagnosis. And that relates not to my cystic fibrosis, but the fact that one of the bacteria in my lungs is MRSA, which is a type of bacteria that is very resistant to a lot of medications. Because my lungs grow that bacteria, I am on what's called contact isolation when I'm in the hospital. That means every time anybody comes into my room, they have to wear a mask, gown, and gloves. And anytime I leave my room, I have to do the same. When this was discovered in my lungs as a kid, I was basically told that it's not something that is an immediate threat to me, but it can be a huge threat to somebody who has just got out of surgery or is dealing with specific types of sicknesses. Now, it has grown to be a bigger problem for me as different antibiotics have lost their effectiveness on treating my lung infections through the years. But whenever I was first told about it and put on isolation, it was even more strict than what it is now because I was not allowed to leave my room at all for the entire time I was admitted. And that was a huge change for me as a kid and how I would pass the time when I was admitted. Before that, I remember times where I would go to other kids' rooms and we would be playing with their toys, or they might come into my room and we'd be playing with whatever I brought with me. And besides going into each other's rooms, which was probably discouraged even at the time, um, there was a common play area that had a bunch of like dramatic play setups, and they had art supplies, and there was a video game station that was set up, and that was always, of course, the most popular. But that was a place that we could go whenever we were not, whenever we didn't need to be in our rooms for either a breathing treatment or to get an IV administered. We could go in there to play with all the cool stuff and to hang out with other kids. And then they would have little events where somebody would come in and either put on a little show or some interactive games they would do to help make everybody just have a better time while they were in the hospital. So once I started having to be in isolation during my times in the hospital, that obviously was not an option for me anymore. Another thing I did that helped me pass the time that ended up getting taken away as an option once I got put on isolation is going and checking out this really elaborate miniature train display that they had near the main entrance of the children's hospital. This was a massive setup with a lot of mountain range area and some forested area mixed in around a bunch of lakes that were put throughout, and a couple of villages and towns that were also incorporated into the setup. And I would be able to spend an hour at a time just watching the train and running from one part when it goes into the tunnel on into a mountain and trying to run around and catch it coming out of the tunnel on the other side, or spending a lot of time just looking at the little details that they put into the towns or to the mountains or to the forest, and just kind of get captivated by imagining what their lives were like, what they were what was going on in their world in the display. On top of following the different trains, I think there was like 7 different trains that were going around on the tracks. Once the playroom and the option of leaving my room to go look at the train display was taken away, then I relied a lot on television. Now, for me, through a lot of my childhood, that wasn't so bad because there was cable channels in the hospital. And growing up, we did not have cable. So there were more options, and I got to watch shows there that I would not normally get to watch. I only watched Blue's Clues in the hospital. Rugrats was something I didn't get to watch at home, but I got to watch whenever I was in the hospital. So part of every admission was on that first day, I would basically be mapping out what shows come on at what time so that I knew whether it was time to turn it to the Disney Channel or Cartoon Network or Nickelodeon. And I would always start off with ESPN back when Sports Center really mattered because there wasn't as much nonstop access to everything. And especially for me as a young kid that loves sports, I loved the idea of being updated and seeing all these highlights. That was very novel to me, not having cable access. So I would always start with SportsCenter, and then I would be spending like the first 5 minutes of every 30 minutes time period flipping and seeing what shows are on what channel, and then making my decision and having it mapped out so that for the rest of my stay, I knew, okay, 9:30, Nick, 10 o'clock, Cartoon Network. And that's how I spent a lot of my time once I was confined to my room fully. I still had my go bag back then as a kid, and I still always had books with me. I'd usually be bringing Goosebumps books whenever I was a younger kid. And I also always would bring Mad magazines and puzzle books. Then they started having this rolling game station where they'd have a TV and a game system hooked up to the TV on a cart that they would be able to roll into patients' rooms that I would usually get every stay for at least a day or two, sometimes, if I was lucky, 3 or 4 days at a time. And I would always be sure to put in the request for that as soon as I got admitted, because I knew that I might have to wait a couple days. There might be some other kid having it, and I wanted to make sure that every nurse knew that, yes, I do want that. And then whenever they would roll it in, that was always a very exciting moment for me, because it was meant that I didn't just have to watch TV. I could actually play some games now. Now, even with me bringing my own books and having a game rolled into the room for me and having access to cable that I don't normally have, I still would end up finding myself just feeling trapped and going off the walls with boredom at times and really feeling lonely. Spending a lot of your day as a kid in the room where nurses are in and out, but you don't really have somebody that you are talking to and hanging out with, it can really make the whole experience a lot more difficult at times. And there were some nurses sometimes that would try to sit and talk. I remember one time in particular, there was a nurse that sat and talked with me for maybe 30 minutes in the room, longer than she needed to be there, about different scary movies, because I had mentioned that I watched Child's Play and Nightmare on Elm Street. And at the time, I think I was like 8 or 9 years old. And so she at first was like, you're too young to be watching those. And then after that, we started telling each other different scary stories that we actually were creeped out by. But of course, eventually she has to go take care of other patients. And then I'm there alone again. Now, my mom would come and spend evenings and spend the night when I was younger and bring my little brother as well. But she had to work during the day and usually wouldn't be getting there until about 7 at night or so. And on top of that, a lot of those times it ended up bringing its own kind of chaos and stress, to where I had asked her to stop coming and spending the night with me. And it took several years of me trying to wear her down before she finally relented that she didn't need to be up there the whole time. But even when she was going, like I said, she wouldn't be getting there until much later in the day. So most of the day I was there by myself. Now, in order to counteract that, the hospital did have a program called Child Life that, I don't know if they were volunteers or if they were employees, but somebody would come into your room and hang out with you for 1 or 2 hours, depending on how busy they were that day, where they would play board games with you, or if you had the game cart in your room, they'd try to play a couple games with you, or just talk to you about different things for a while. I would always make sure that my mom had called and put in a request for somebody to come hang out with me. And then at a certain point, I started calling every morning myself, putting in that request. And I would end up, as a kid, you feel like time's taking a lot longer than it actually is taking. So I probably would call them maybe every hour to make sure that my name is on the list and try to get an estimate of if somebody would be able to come to me that day or not, and if so, when. And then whenever they said somebody would be there in a couple hours, I'd call back in another hour just to make sure that we're still on schedule. In my teenage years, I probably just accepted the loneliness that came with the hospital, the same way that I accepted every other aspect of the hospital as just normal. And that's the time period where I probably played the most video games while I was in the hospital, whether it be a handheld Game Boy or having a PlayStation that I would hook up to the TV. And that's also why I always really appreciated whenever I did have a nurse or a respiratory therapist or somebody that would engage in conversation that was not just about my illness or what was ever going on with me at the time, as far as my condition, but to be able to hear other people tell me about what's going on in their lives, and for me to ask questions to them, or for us to just talk about whatever subject we were thinking about at the time, that was always felt extremely needed. And then in my young adulthood, I already mentioned that my wife pretty much started staying with me as soon as we started dating. And we started dating whenever I was still 20. So that really helped alleviate all the feelings of loneliness that the hospital brought. And while it helped me stay entertained on the weekends a lot more and gave me something to look forward to for the evenings, my days have pretty much stayed true to me just passing the time with whatever books I have and whatever show I'm watching at the time. Now, seeing as we have all these streaming services, I usually take my laptop and am planning on catching up on whatever series was next on my list. And I still always appreciate whenever I can have a good conversation with any of the staff. I've even had several times where I have accepted the pastor that works at the church to come in and talk to me just so I can have a debate on religion or a conversation on a religion that I don't believe in, including me just trying to push them to make sure that they're logically consistent with their beliefs and just trying to milk it for as much entertainment as I can get out of the conversation. Like I said at the start of this episode, being in the hospital was always normal for me. So despite the lack of freedom, despite the poke count and the boredom and the loneliness that I felt a lot of the time in it, it never felt like an ordeal that I was going through. It just felt like another part of life. And just like in every other part of life, I've always tried to make the best of my situation. So I would always try to control my mindset whenever it was time for me to be admitted and look at it like an opportunity to do something that I wouldn't normally get to do. I really try to make it easier for myself by framing it in my head as this is what I get to do. Because if I focus on what I don't get to do, it can become really heavy. Whether it be through getting to eat as much as I want, whenever I want, which was not always an option for me growing up, and even now as an adult is not an option for me to do without the extra cost that goes with that. Playing video games a lot longer than I normally would have played at home, or watching shows that I would not have got to watch at home, or reading more than I would normally read in my day-to-day life, or talking to people that I would not ever get to talk to if I was not admitted, or in my current life, trying to set the mindset of it being a vacation from parenthood. As a stay-at-home father, I'm pretty much never off the clock. So at least when I'm in the hospital, I don't have to have a turn where it's time for me to be a father when I got a kid having a tantrum or two kids fighting each other over what toy they want to play with. I always try to tell myself, even when I'm in the hospital, remember, you only got one life to live. You might as well enjoy it while it lasts.